leaders of America's closest European allies will be coming to Washington this week for the annual NATO summit. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is here. Good morning, Secretary General. Great to have you here at the table. Let me read you a headline from the Wall Street Journal. Quote, the world saw President Biden deteriorating. Democrats ignored warnings. European leaders and officials expressed worries about his focus and stamina. You're meeting with NATO leaders this week in Washington. You're close with President Biden and many other NATO leaders. What's your real take on the private assessment of the President of the United States among NATO leaders?
I'm absolutely confident that when all NATO leaders convene here this week, it will be a great summit. We will celebrate the 75th anniversary of the most successful alliance in history. And I just met President Biden in the Oval Office a couple of weeks ago, and that was a good and productive meeting where we prepared all the important decisions we'll make here on defense, on support for Ukraine, and not least on burden sharing that European allies are now really stepping up and spending record amount of money on defense, and of course also on China and how we need to work together. So this is a substance of the summit, and of course these decisions would not have been possible to make without a strong US leadership.
There's no question. The substance is what matters. But we just heard from Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, a Republican who's close to the Republican nominee. He's saying he has concerns that world leaders don't trust President Biden to be in command of the job. You speak privately with these people. What's the truth here? Are there concerns or not among NATO leaders?
But if I started to comment on issues like that, then suddenly NATO, I will be part of domestic debate.
Well, it'd be easy to just say no or yes.
But I think it's important for NATO to stay out of that kind of domestic discussions. They are, of course, important in the United States, but NATO should not be part of it. What matters for NATO is the decisions what to do together. And just, for instance, on defense spending, which has been a big issue for the United States for many years under different presidents, when we made a pledge 10 years ago to increase defense spending, only 3 allies spent 2% of GDP on defense. This year it's 23 allies, an increase just this year of 18% across Europe and Canada. So record high investments by European allies.
I understand you want to focus on that, but you've just been with President Biden, as you said, in the Oval Office. What's your personal assessment? Is he someone you can work with in an effective way on the policy issues?
We had a productive meeting, and of course there is no way to make these big decisions on how to further strengthen NATO, enlarge NATO, new members, without having a strong US leadership.
Why such a long timeline to bring in Ukraine? You've talked about a 10-year window. Why is it 10 years versus maybe 1 or 2 or 3 years since they're facing war?
Well, no one has said exactly 10 years, but it's obvious that it is a very serious issue to bring in Ukraine because Ukraine is now a country at war. Ukraine has been attacked by Russia. So the most important thing we should do is to step up our support to Ukraine to ensure that Ukraine prevails. That's a precondition for any future membership for Ukraine.
Stay with us. We'll have more questions for the Secretary General soon. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We return to our conversation with the NATO Secretary General. Secretary General Stoltenberg, thanks for sticking around with us. What are the specific deliverables of this NATO summit, especially when it comes to whether there could be training and an alliance plan for NATO troops with Ukraine?
Well, we make important decisions on stepping up our support to Ukraine, and NATO will take over the provision and the coordination of security assistance to Ukraine and also training. We will have a command established in Germany and with logistical hubs in the eastern part of the alliance to help to get over the equipment, the ammunition, and also the training for the Ukrainian forces. And this is a big and important deliverable from the summit to ensure a more robust framework for our support to Ukraine.
So the NATO leaders are in Washington focusing on that deliverable, but the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán on Friday was just in Moscow meeting with Vladimir Putin. Would you discourage him to continue those talks, and just should he let NATO handle this at this point?
Prime Minister Orbán, he made it clear when he came to Moscow that he didn't go there on behalf of NATO. Different NATO allies interact with Moscow in different ways. What matters for me is that all allies have agreed that we need to do more for Ukraine, both with this new training and assistance that NATO will provide to Ukraine, but also with a long-term pledge. And I also expect that by the summit that starts next week, allies will make a new announcement announcements of more air defense and more ammunition. So yes, Hungary also Prime Minister Orbán has been in Moscow, but that doesn't change the common decisions we have made as NATO.
Does it affect NATO in any way to have Orbán doing his own thing?
No, because the reality is that we are able to make decisions on how we are going to step up our support to Ukraine, because we all want peace. The thing is that the easiest way to end the war is to lose the war, but that's not peace, that's occupation. So therefore we need a lasting, just peace, and the only way to get there is to convince President Putin that he will not win on the battlefield. He has to sit down and accept a solution where Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent nation in Europe, and the only way to convince Putin that he will not win on the battlefield is to provide military support to Ukraine. So a negotiated solution that is lasting for Ukraine requires military support to Ukraine.
It's notable, Secretary General, that Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea will be joining this summit. Is this about trying to come up with a strategy for China as China works with Russia on its war with Ukraine?
Yes, very much so, because the war in Ukraine demonstrates how closely aligned Russia and China and North Korea and Iran are. China is the main enabler of Russia's war aggression against Ukraine. President Xi and President Putin, they all want NATO, the United States, to fail in Ukraine. And if Putin wins in Ukraine, it will not only embolden President Putin, also embolden President Xi. As the Japanese Prime Minister said, what happens in Ukraine today can happen in Asia tomorrow. So it demonstrates that NATO is important for the United States also when it comes to addressing China. The United States is big, but in NATO you have something that no other big power has, and that is more than 30 friends and allies. The United States is 25% of the world's GDP. Together with NATO allies, we have twice as much, 50% of the world's economic and military might. So the United States is stronger also in addressing China together with NATO.
And last thing here quickly, Secretary General, last week the American military's European command raised the threat level at bases on the continent to what's called Charlie. That's the second highest of 5 threat levels. Do you share, as the leader of NATO, this heightened concern about security in Europe?
Yes, we always have to be vigilant and aware of threat of terrorist actions, and therefore it is important that the US command is vigilant and take the decisions on alert levels which they deem necessary.
What's driving it? Is it Gaza, Ukraine, the Olympics?
It is a combination. It's always a bit dangerous or difficult to go into the details of intelligence, but NATO, the US, we have to be aware of the constant threat of new terrorist attacks, and that's exactly what we are by also exchanging more intelligence and working together.
Secretary General Stoltenberg, thanks for being here. We appreciate it.